Hello, this is Kate Jones here with Patricia Falvey, the author of 5 historical novels, including her latest, The Famine Orphans, which came out in May. All 5 novels have a connection to Ireland. Welcome, Patricia. I have been so looking forward to talking with you.
Thank you, Kate. It's great to be here. I appreciate it.
Let's start off, if you don't mind, with you at 20 years old, immigrating alone to the
Mhm.
U.S. Why did you come? What was that like? And how did you make your way? You can start with any one of those.
Well, yes, I was 20, and there's a long story prior to that, but I had been raised in Ireland with my grandmother until I was about 8. And then my parents, whom I really didn't know very well, they used to show up at Christmas and the holidays from England. They lived in England. And one time, my mother just showed up and took me with her back to England. So I never quite bonded with my parents because I always had wanted to go back to Ireland and my grandmother. I mean, it wasn't a horrible life, but it was just fraught a little bit and a little bit emotionally distant. So anyway, I had a sense of adventure. The other thing was in looking around at what my options were as a working class kid in England, looking to make my way in a career of any kind. I just thought, well, if I'm going to have to settle for like a mediocre life here, I think I might like to go and have some fun, excitement, experiment. I think what did it for me too was the long Irish history of people immigrating to the United States. So I thought I would do it. I thought I would come to America for a couple of years. Well, that didn't happen. But so what I did was I applied and answered all the questions, including the customs question. Are you planning to engage in prostitution? Which was very interesting because they did ask that on the immigration application. So I said no, thinking, I hope not. But so anyway, I looked at the map. I had no clue how big America was. I looked at the map and saw that Omaha was in the middle. And so I thought, well, that's kind of cool. I can drive to Boston. I can drive to LA. I can see all these other places if I just start there. The other reason for that was that I could not get a visa for the East Coast. I was applying as a secretary because I knew how to type and I'd taken some classes. And it was during that phase in the East Coast in particular that a lot of executives were hiring British secretaries because the accent was very sought after. And there was just this run on British secretaries. And I couldn't get agreement or consent to do that. So I ended up in Omaha. Interestingly, I stopped in New York. I felt really sad when I arrived at JFK. I don't know if it was even Kennedy Airport at the time. It probably was. But when I arrived there and everybody else had people rushing to greet them and I didn't have anyone, and that was a little bit sad. And then I got on a bus into New York City. And I remember the bus driver, move along, move along. You know how they are in New York. And I took out all these coins and promptly dropped them all on the floor of the bus. That was because, I got very frustrated, confused. But to give people credit, a lot of people got up and helped me gather up the coins. So then I got into New York and I stayed at the Manhattan Hotel, which to me sounded very New York. And then I got on a Greyhound bus and went on this bus across the country to Omaha and was kind of let down when the bus pulled in the middle of the night to Castle Bluffs, Iowa, which is actually a lovely town, but it was not what I had hoped for. And I thought to myself, oh my God, I just came 5,000 miles to this. So then the bus started up again and went over the bridge and into Omaha. And I stayed there for 2 years. And then it became pretty evident that in order to get anywhere in life, I would need to get a college degree. And I had some college credits to my credit before I came, but not enough for it to mean anything. And so that's when a friend of mine said, well, if you're going to go to college, you should try Boston. And so I ended up going to Boston, met these girls who were very cute girls from Cincinnati who were going to be study in Boston, and they told me about the SATs and all of that kind of thing, which I'd never understood. I've never taken a multiple choice exam in my life. So I did that. And then I wrote to every school I could find in the telephone directory and said, I'd like to go to your school. And Suffolk University. And I told them this the other day at the reunion meeting, that they were not only the only ones who responded, but they responded with an offer of a foreign scholarship. So they gave me my start.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
So, what did you do in Omaha?
I worked for the Lyndon Johnson Poverty Program, known as the Job Corps. And it was a real eye opener for me because, coming from Ireland and England, pretty much the only people I knew were English, Irish, Scottish, or Welsh. This was a plan. I think it's still in existence, the Job Corps, but it was a plan to take girls between the ages of like 18 and 21 or somewhere around there from inner cities, from poverty stricken areas. And they gave them business lessons and all kinds of things. And so one of my jobs was to help them with business practices because I'd had a couple of years working. I would speak to the girls one at a time and try to find out what it was they were interested in learning. And the first one was a young lady from one of the American Indian reservations. And her name was Mary Little Young Man. And I was just fascinated. It was interesting in that there were girls from all ethnicities. We had some really bad problems at times. There were drug problems, there were a few knifings. There were kids that really did want to learn. I mean, it's a mix like anything that you would expect. And very often when I went out on the street at lunchtime, I'd forget to take my badge off. And I was accosted at times by some of the good people of Omaha saying, you people are bringing all these derelict people here and da, 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 da. It was a real eye opener. And I was there for 2 years and made some friends, like I said, and then went to Boston. So that was like phase one of my journey.
So, you go to Suffolk University,
Yes.
and what's your major?
Well, funny you should ask. I enrolled as an English major because I was very interested in either writing or being a journalist or something to do with writing. It was just there inside me. So I enrolled as an English major, and my first professor was a fellow named Eugene O'Neill. And I said, oh, this is a sign I'm going to be a writer. As it turned out, I mean, the Suffolk was pretty cheap at that time, and I was getting a lot of the tuition paid for and everything. But it still was evident that I was going to need to earn money. I had studied accounting back in England for 2 semesters because my father had said, if you're going to go over there, you need to get a job and you need to study bookkeeping, as he called it. And so I had those credits, and the dean of the business school, when I finally did go approach him, he said, we can work it out. We can get a transfer of those credits. And it saved me a year of school and tuition. But I always tell people it was an abandonment of my dream that lasted about 30 years. So I went on and became an accountant, a CPA, and went back and got a master's degree in taxation. It was a very good career. I have to say it was an especially good career for women. Once they got past the whole idea that they couldn't send you out on audits, particularly if you weren't wearing a pantsuit and things like that. In fact, when I joined one of the firms in New Haven, Connecticut, where I had moved because I got married, there were two of the firms that had interviews at the Eli Club, which is the Yale Club in New Haven. And in both cases, I had to go in through the side door because women weren't allowed in front door. But once I got into the system, I mean, I didn't find much in the way of discrimination at all.
Well, that's very interesting. So, what year was that?
Late 1969, 1970. It had to be 1970 because I was already married by then. So, yeah, at least that time.
And what was your comment about the pantsuit?
It was so obvious what the hidden text was there. Of course, that was the era of the miniskirts. And if you were going to be doing an audit where you had to go climb up ladders once in a while to look and see if there was inventory really in some big bin of some sort, then they didn't want you doing that.
That makes sense.
Yeah, 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 it does. And in some cases, they said the client will not accept nor pay for a young woman coming in and giving them advice. You know, well, that turned out not to be the case over years. In the beginning, there were instances of that. That was, the age of feminism coming into its own and all of that. And I used to want to shake some of the young girls much, much later who would come into these companies and they had their briefcase and they were on a roll. And I used to want to say to them, you have no idea what the rest of us went through so you can be here. Probably less than 5% of the CPAs in Connecticut were women at one point when I got certified. And now I think it's at least half and a half. So they've come a long way.
That is good.
Yeah.
So you had a 30-year career, was it?
At least. I will not let you add up the years, but yes.
No, you had wanted to be a writer,
Right.
or at least to pursue English. Then you went into this totally other field where you must have a tremendous amount of aptitude to do as well as you did and to really rise in the firm that you worked for.
Yeah, I was in industry for a little while. After I left the firm that I was working with in Connecticut, I then worked briefly, 4 years for the Department of Motor Vehicles in Connecticut. I suppose you could call me a political hack, but I was an assistant to the commissioner. And that was great fun. I did everything from fiscal work to public relations work to whatever. And it was a very interesting stint to see how state government works. Then I ended up going with the Travelers Insurance as an accountant. And I was there for 13 years, 13, 14 years. And at that time, I never expected I would go back into the big 8, 6, 4, as they now are, the big 4. But I had an opportunity. I was also divorced at that point, and I was the itchy feet, as my sister calls it, were still there. And I thought, well, I never got to California. I always wanted to go to California. So I met up with one of the partners from KPMG, actually. And he said, well, why don't you come to California? I was also wrestling with the idea of I still would love to study writing, be a writer. Any free time I got off, I would go to writing conferences. I mean, it just never left me. But I thought, well, so I agreed to go, which was a silly thing for me to do. I agreed to go part-time at KPMG in Los Angeles. And then I thought the rest of the time I can take classes in writing, screenwriting, UCLA, all of this. And so that really didn't work out because I learned very quickly that part-time meant full-time work for part-time money.
Exactly. I have found that out too.
I was there a year. This partner told me that I couldn't live in downtown LA. It was not safe for a woman on her own, and I should go up to near Thousand Oaks, which is 50 miles north of the city. And I ended up at a place called Westlake Village where everyone was beautiful. They really were. So I ended up commuting that 50 miles, which it sometimes took 2 hours one way. And I got so tired of it. And I used to think that if my car went off into a ditch, no one would ever find me because I was up and down the 101 the entire time I was there. So then I had an offer with Deloitte, which I could have done. It's interesting, all these forks in the road. But they were in Santa Monica and they said, we want to give you a substantial bonus for signing on so that you can find a place to live down here in Santa Monica because we don't think you belong up there. But by that time, I had just had enough of California and I had an opportunity with KPMG to move to Dallas. And I kept thinking Dallas is on the way back to the East Coast, so I can do that for a while. Well, that was 20 years ago and I'm still in Dallas. So what can I say? But that's when I ended up actually working with PricewaterhouseCoopers. I left KPMG and was able to go to work for Pricewaterhouse. And when I left after, I think it was 9 years, I was a managing director when I left. And I tell people a funny story that when I left, I mean, there was a lot of eye rolling and Patricia's going off to write the great American novel, but she'll be back, you know. And then they said, well, you will stay on and consult. And after that experience in California, I said, no, I said, I have to be able to do this. I can't stop and start and stop and start. Because I'd already started writing. I'd located an agent, a literary agent, and she already was on my case about writing my first book, actually. And I realized that in between, I was trying to write it and still work. And I was on a plane every other week because I ran a national insurance premium tax practice. And I would lose the thread of the book. And I got to the point where I would dream that I was seeing my characters from the book pounding on the stage, going, where's the rest of our dialogue?
You would have those dreams?
Oh, yeah. It was like, what is that story? 6 characters in search of an author or something. But it was, yeah. I swear. The only thing at Pricewaterhouse in one of my evaluations, well, Patricia is, you know, obviously I was doing very well with them and bringing in a lot of money. And they said, you know, she is eccentric, but the clients seem to love her. You know? So anyway, a quick story. By the time I ended up going to this reunion for PricewaterhouseCoopers, a friend of mine was partner. She was leaving. And I knew a lot of the people that I'd worked with would be there. And it was at the Dallas Petroleum Club, which is very chic. And by that time, I'd finished the book, and my agent had gotten back to me that I'd gotten a 2-book contract from Hachette, which is the biggest literary group in the world.
And this is before the publication of The Yellow House?
This was the Yellow House. I mean, I had written it. It was before it went through the edits and all of that sort of thing. But they'd made me not a 1-book, but a 2-book author.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So, but it was funny when I went to this reunion, I already had that information. And I tell people when I speak of it that I'm not usually into revenge, but in this case I was, just for fun. And so I tell people I went out and I bought the dress, I got the hair done, the makeup, and I sashayed into the Petroleum Club. And so these guys were all coming up to me, these partners. Hello, Patricia, how are you? And how's the book? You know, like they were ready to console me and invite me back. And I did the hair flip. I never did the hair flip, but I did the hair flip. And at that point, I said, well, funny you should ask, but I just got a 2-book offer from Hachette. They're the largest in the world, you know. And all of a sudden, the conversation stopped. In almost all cases, the partner, the person would be, oh, excuse me, I see John over there. I must go speak to him. Because it was like I was not following the script and they didn't know what to say, except for one guy who said, well, does that mean we can get books for free? Most of the other people were like really happy that I'd done this. And it was almost like I had escaped from Alcatraz, because there is that golden, you know, handcuffs that people, they're doing very well financially. They're on the track. It's very hard to get off that track. And it was hard for me because, I mean, I knew better than anybody, being an accountant, what the odds were of making a living and getting a book published. And so it was one of those things that I tell people I just went on faith. And I really came to understand what faith meant when I did that. And so that's how I got to where I could finally call myself a writer, not a wannabe. And that took a while. That took a while before I could actually announce that I was a writer. And it came in handy later when I would go and do research and go to places in little towns in Ireland or wherever. I remember once asking to get into Armagh's women's prison, because in the back of my mind, I do have an idea about writing a book about that. And I had my sister with me, and it had been closed because they were going to make it into a hotel, oddly enough. And I said, well, I'm a writer. And, you know, all they wanted was an acknowledgement of their name in the book somewhere. And they took me on the tours and all of that. So I grew in confidence after that, but it took a long time. But it's great for cocktail parties now because when I used to tell people, what do you do? Well, I'm a CPA and I have a degree in taxation. I work with insurance companies, people are moving away. But, oh, you're a writer. Oh, I always wanted to talk to a writer. Da, da, da. So it's been fun. I tell people I'm nowhere near as rich as I was, but I'm much happier and I don't have that pull anymore. And then the other thing I like to try to tell people is there's always a second act. And I'm living proof of that, that you should never, if you can help it, give up on your dreams. It's never too late. You're never too old. There's always lots of reasons why you couldn't, shouldn't do it. But if you want to feel good about the remainder of your life and what you're doing, then I think it's worth taking a chance.
And there's also a reason you have that dream, that you have that call, that part of you that wants to do something. And if you don't take heed of that
Mhm.
call, it
Mhm.
can be really detrimental.
It can, and that's what I'm saying because I used to feel like I was being pulled in two different directions and I was never satisfied. And lots of people would say, well, you've done so well. And what they didn't say was for an immigrant, but it didn't satisfy me. And I do tell people actually, because writing goes way, way back for me when I was a very little girl, about 4 or 5 years old. I never had any trouble going to bed because I used to tell myself serialized stories. And I couldn't wait to go to bed to find out what happened next. I was always, always interested in writing. And
You would be lying in bed as a little girl thinking stories in
yeah,
your head or actually telling them to
I'd
yourself.
be telling myself the story of
Right.
the little girl and what she was doing and what her adventures were and what was happening next and what friends she met and all that. Sort of thing. Yeah, I was having a good old time in my head.
That is so charming.
So I was born to do this anyway.
Yes. You write historical fiction novels.
Oh,
So
yeah.
why that particular genre?
So no, I've always been interested in history. Yeah, I always liked history. Because to me, they were stories. They are stories. And well, first of all, the connection with Ireland is still very big for me. And I think it goes back to that point at which I always said if I were ever to write a memoir, I might start it with I was 8 years old when my mother came and stole me, because that is really what happened. I was pulled away from the only place I knew, the only quasi mother that I knew. And to this day, I still have that thing. It's a lot better now because I've spent a lot more time over there and so forth. But it was that rupture that just never seemed to heal. And in a way, my writing about Ireland is part of channeling that to kind of reconnect with my own history and my family's history and Irish history. That's what I'm drawn to. But the Yellow House was based on stories my grandmother told me.
Hey,
Yes. And during that time of writing that, I, again, eccentric or crazy, but I could hear her voice telling the story. I could hear her voice in my ear. Ostensibly, what I started out to do was write this story about the Irish uprising and when Southern Ireland gained its independence, but Northern Ireland remained part of Britain. And part of it was that I would get so many questions about, well, all the Irish people in the south of Ireland seem to get along. What's wrong with you people up in the north? This is when the troubles were raging. And I said, well, the history is very, very different. And mostly it's because of something called the plantation, where Southern Ireland, the land was taken, but it was taken by dukes and aristocrats and people who had, fought for the king and all of that, and they would get land grants. So they were always the ones with the big manor houses and so on and so forth. But the plantation in the north of Ireland was when British government sent farmers and steel workers and, people of the working class and gave them land to pursue whatever their talent was. And so they became part of that fabric down. with the working class people as opposed to just these sort of absentee landlords. And they did that because the British government was having a lot of trouble suppressing the uprisings that were happening in the North. A lot of them were Scottish Protestants, Presbyterians, and they grew and multiplied and so on. That's why they became the majority. And it was very, very hard, I think, for the Catholics to then end up dealing with that. I explained an awful lot of it in the book, but that was the reason I did it. My grandmother, she was in the thing called, well, I forget now the name of it, but the Irish Women's Group sort of equivalent. And my grandfather fought with Michael Collins. My grandmother used to tell stories about him. She would say things like, he would come home in the middle of the night and I'd hear the knock on the back door and I'd open it up and there he was running from the bastards, excuse me, French. And she said, and I'd have to pull the thorns out of his feet because he had no shoes on and da 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 da. So all these great stories. I wove a lot of that into the first book, The Yellow House. And that is the book I think that is truly from my heart. And it's still selling, even though it came out in 2010. It's still selling. So that was followed by The Linen Queen, the first book, The Yellow House. The heroine in the book, Eileen O'Neill, AKA my grandmother, she worked in a linen mill. A lot of the Catholic women, the only jobs they could get, because there was a great deal of job discrimination anyway, but the only jobs they could get were in spinning factories and weaving factories. Turned out that my mother worked briefly in a linen mill. My grandmother worked in a linen mill. My great-grandmother worked in a linen mill. And so I became fascinated by the linen mills. And they were mostly owned by Quakers, which I thought was rather interesting. And so I was back in Ireland and talking to somebody, and I changed the names of the mill and so on, but everybody recognized where it was. And everybody had a story of somebody in their family who worked in the Bestwood mill. And so then I ended up just talking to somebody, I think when I did a launch of the Yellow House in Ireland. And I think the nice thing was that while I was there, I was able to find the grave where my grandmother had been buried because nobody really knew. And we found it and we erected a headstone. And I felt like I had done the full circle at that point. But anyway, so somebody was talking about it and they said, they used to have beauty competitions in the linen mills all across the north. And whoever won it was known as the Linen Queen for that period of time.
And they were beauty competitions?
Yeah, well, beauty and grace and good behavior, like Miss America's first event. I thought, that'd make a great title. And so then I set the book in 1942 because I knew a lot of stories of young American soldiers who camped out around Northern Ireland during World War II. And many of them who had been there were part of the D-Day landing. And so that's really the story of how a small town in the north of Ireland was changed by these soldiers coming there. And they all got to know them, and many of the American soldiers would go to dinner every Sunday with some family. So when D-Day happened, it just shook that part of the country to its knees because they knew all these kids and they were all very upset. They could quote you the names of all the beaches, like Juno Beach and so on. And it was a very interesting time. And I just thought, well, that might make a good story. But what I usually do, the reason it's historical fiction as well, is that I take real events and then I take ordinary characters and I tell the story of what it was like for these ordinary characters living through these major events. And that's really the theme that goes through all of my books. The third one is The Girls of Ennismore. That story was the first one I set in the west of Ireland in County Mayo, where my father's family came from. My mother's family is from the north. It's been called like an Irish Downton Abbey. It's set in a manor house, but against the backdrop of World War I and the Easter Uprising, which was 1916 in Dublin. And I have Rosie, who is the tenant farmer's daughter, who was brought to take lessons to be a companion for the young girl, Victoria, who is from the aristocratic family. So they grow up together. But then, of course, when it's time for Victoria's coming out and she goes off to London or wherever, and then Rosie is like, well, you get back to the farm. Yeah. And so Rosie ended up going to Dublin, and the girls do meet up at some point, but it's like the different paths that they take. And then, hopefully there's some reasonably nice ending for it. In that one, I referenced the Titanic because a lot of young people had sailed on the Titanic out of Ireland. There's one little village which was right down the street from where I set this book and from where I had spent summer childhoods at my father's family's farm. And it's a little village called Laherdan. And 17 young people died on the Titanic in that one little tiny village. Some part of that is in the Girls of Ennismore. And interestingly enough, my next book was called The Titanic Sisters. So that was the first time I tell people that I let my heroines off of the island of Ireland. They got to leave Ireland. And in this case, the Titanic sisters are two sisters from County Donegal, which is Southern Ireland, but it's geographically in the north, if you can imagine. It's all very complex. But the one sister, the mother loves her and she can do no wrong, and the other sister has a hard time of it. But they both end up going to America and headed to New York on the Titanic because a wealthy cousin has sent some money. He needs a nanny for his daughter. So they get there. Neither sister knows whether the other one survived. And one takes the place of the other one. But then I move it to Texas. And I'd been in Texas so long, and I thought, I really know a lot about what went on in Texas history. It might be kind of fun to do that. So I had these two Irish girls end up just as the oil rush was starting to happen in Texas. And so had some fun bringing in some real Texas characters. And one woman in particular named Mayflower, who has all these great Texas sayings.
I loved her character.
Yeah, wasn't she lovely?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what she said, her mother was so full with pride that she carried her nose so high that she might have drowned in a rainstorm. I mean, just some real great things that I was able to do with that. I just enjoyed that. And that book was pretty popular. And
Oh, yeah.
the local Texan people. And I'm always waiting for that one person who said, you got that wrong. And that's the problem with historical fiction. I was asked the other day at my Suffolk University reunion event, why is it called historical fiction? And I said, well, in a way, it's kind of an oxymoron. How can it be historical and fiction? And I said, it's kind of like fake news. But first of all, people have to realize it is fiction. Some part of it is fictionalized. But I always try to keep the actual events and places and whatever details I can. I try to keep those as genuine and accurate as I can. In The Famine Orphans, my latest book, which was really a marathon of research because it's set in the 1840s and early 1850s. And that's going back a long way. And my girls had to go on this 3 to 4 month ship ride on a very small sailing ship from England down to Australia. So I had to research all this stuff about what those ships were like and something about how they run and the wind and how all this works. And my geography had to be improved. I kind of followed the route that they went and so on. So there was an awful lot of, and I'm still waiting for somebody from Australia now to say, well, you got this wrong. Doesn't happen too often. The Lennon Queen was really interesting because I got challenged a couple of times on the fact that there were actually little Jewish orphans from the war in Northern Ireland in this place called Mill Isle. And they went to school with the kids there. And they actually had like a little kibbutz, a little farm. And they had a synagogue. And I remember one Jewish book club, some lady saying, well, that's not true. And I said, yes, I've been there. I've talked to people who know about it. And she said, well, how come an Irish woman knows more about our history than we do? And so she was quite put out. But then the better thing was I was at a book club signing in Greenwich, Connecticut. And I got the same thing from a lady who said, oh, you made that up, right? And I said, no, it's true. And another lady who happened to be there in the audience said, oh, yes, it's true because my great great grandfather was one of the four gentlemen from Belfast who bought that property in Mill Isle where they set it up for all these kids to come to. Felt good after that. But, it does happen. I mean, you can't get everything right, but you try. And with this book in particular, I think because it's a true story, which is kind of interesting because everything else I've written about, yeah, they're all true stories, but they're no. And this story, very few people actually know it. And it's about 4,000 young Irish female orphans between the ages of 14 and 19 who were persuaded by the English government and then the governors of the workhouses. They were all in workhouses because of the famine. And this was like 1846, 47, and on from there. And it was because of the famine. They had lost their parents and so on. And all the workhouses are very overcrowded. So the Australian colonists, the people in charge there, and the English, and Australia was a colony, obviously, of England at that time. And so they said, well, if we got a deal for you, why don't we pay to take all these girls of a certain age out of the workhouses and we'll put them on a boat and we'll pay for the trip and we'll buy them some clothes and we'll guarantee them jobs as domestic servants in Australia because Australia had lots of big houses. There are a lot of aristocracy living there, but they didn't have a lot of servants. And they thought, well, this would be a way to do it. And the girls were given a choice. They said, you can stay here and starve, or you can take this. And so most of them accepted it. What they didn't say, what was kind of a hidden agenda, was that there were all these male prisoners in Australia because Australia had been England's outdoor prison, basically. And a lot of those prisoners had been there more than 10 years and they had sort of earned their ticket of leave. They'd served their sentence, but they were rough and ready. And the Australians wanted to build settlements. And to build settlements, they had to get these guys to settle down and be civilized, quote unquote. And so they thought, all these girls will come and we'll all marry and this will be great. So a win-win, and it's not totally what happened. So anyway, I tell this story. And part of the reason I wanted to write it is because two things. One, I was born in a town called Newry in the north of Ireland, and there were workhouses there. And I found out that there were around 25 girls from the Newry workhouse who had gone to Australia. And I thought that could have been me in a different time. That could have been one of my relatives. So I had a kinship already, knowing that some of them were from Newry. And then also the fact that I'm an immigrant. And I thought I could at least give some idea to the reader of how it would feel for these young girls, many of whom had never been off their farm or whatever, coming to this really strange place that they had no idea even existed and to try to make their way. And so I felt I could, in many ways, speak for them. And I think that's why this book has meant a lot to me to do. It's kind of like up there with the Yellow House. I've tried to give voice to these girls. And what's been interesting in the last few years, the Australians have started to focus on this story. And they've got a memorial museum in Sydney. And they've had lots of genealogists come and lots of people are tracing their relatives back through to these girls. And they've become known colloquially as the mothers of Australia, which I think is kind of cool. What I haven't said was more than 20 ships sailed with these girls. And the first couple had a prevalence of people from Belfast. So you got to know the Belfast people. They'll speak out and so on. And so anyway, there was a ship's doctor who was in charge of the first set of girls who went on this boat called the Earl Grey. And it turned out that he had a hard time with disciplining them and so on. So when they got to Sydney, he just put up such a ruckus about how terrible they were and how low class and low lives they were and how they would make terrible servants, things like that. And it was picked up by the press. And then when it was picked up by the Sydney Herald, then it became a story in Melbourne and Adelaide and some of the other areas around there. So people began to be very wary of these girls. And the ones who came subsequently kind of paid the price for that because they found a great deal of discrimination. It was anti-Irish, it was anti-Catholic. That those who didn't get hired right away had a very hard time making it. A lot of them turned to prostitution. That's how it worked. But a lot of them did over time succeed. And so in this story, I follow 6 girls. Kate, my main character, is the narrator, but I follow 6 and they all have somewhat different experiences. And again, it was interesting that just timing was kind of cool because the outback of Australia, where people in and around Sydney and elsewhere were wanting to put down roots and have farms and so on and so forth. And they had no idea really that how bad the outback could be. And Kate is one of the ones who ends up out there with her husband trying to get a farm going. And then he has to take off because they're not making it. And she's left with the isolation, which was worse than anything. I mean, there was nobody around for miles, no other human being. So I use her to sort of illustrate how that would have been for the people. And then right on top of that, the Australian gold rush started. So I lived some of my carriages up through the experience of the gold rush. And that was coincidental, kind of like the oil boom here in Texas, just coincided with what I was writing. So I did take a ride through the gold fields and discovered how a lot of that worked. But I make sure that I follow all of the orphans. And
Did you go to Australia?
no, I meant to go. And that's the one thing that I'm really a little nervous about. But I'm thinking it certainly can't look today the way it looked in 1850. So I know I have that going for me, but I just made up for what I could with research. The reason I couldn't go, because I was planning to, and then I was running a little behind on my time for the book deadline. But on top of that, I had an odd accident with an Uber driver who backed up over my foot and broke my foot in several places. And therefore, I wasn't able to travel. I was in pain. I wasn't able to write. And so there was no way I was going to get to go to Australia and finish the book on time. It just didn't happen. But I'm still hopeful that I'll get to go. Maybe they'll invite me over now once they know that I've written this. It's very interesting. My publisher is probably one of the few independent publishers in New York, at Kensington Books, and they've been very good and very open to whatever I wanted to do. But with the Titanic Sisters, I had 2 publishers. I had a publisher in England and a publisher here, Kensington. And so I went back to that same publisher in England with this book, and I should have known there was going to be an issue because when I went to them with The Girls of Ennismore, I had a character in there who was a doctor and he was a morphine addict. And so I describe a scene where the main character goes to his room and, it's a mess because the guy's been locked in there and she's trying to coax him out. And so this editor, who sounded like she was about 12 years old to me on the phone, very British accent, said, well, we quite like that scene, but we were rather hoping you would take out the smelly bits. And I go, excuse me, smelly bits? You don't smell in England? I don't know. But anyway, moving on to the Famine Orphans, of course, you can't write a book like that about that time and not mention the Aboriginal population. I mean, it just is part of the history. And Kate does have encounters with them. And she reflects on the people she sees and in many ways finds parallels with Ireland because she says their land was taken from them and so it was ours, you know. And it was the same publisher who said, we can't have you talking about the native population. It's a very sensitive subject. And I said, well, then we won't bother because I have to put it in there.
It's integral, actually, to Kate's story because somebody prevented something awful.
Yes, 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 yeah.
I
And
don't
that
want to
just,
say too much.
no, but that was the part that just kind of came to me. And I already
Yeah,
put that character in there.
it was a huge relief when it happened because I really liked Kate's character.
Yeah,
She went through a lot of tough stuff. And
she
this
did.
is one thing that I do want to say about the Famine Orphans is that there's a lot of grimness, of course, from the title on. You're going to get tough stuff in there. However, you have a really good balance between the darkness and the light. There's
Right.
hope. I appreciate that because even in the worst of it, there's hope.
Well, I think one of the things I wanted to emphasize too with these girls was the idea of resilience. And we all have that. We just have to dig deep to find it. But they were put in enough situations where they had to be resilient. And there's a joy in the ones that really make it and have good, prosperous times and so on. Even the ones who've had it the hardest, may well rise up. And I think that was part of it too, that I really wanted to show that, yeah, they were victims in a way, but they fought against it. And to the extent that they had whatever it took to do it in different ways, they had different talents, different expertise, different whatever, but it was still resilience that got them to a place where they were thriving ultimately. I
Right.
worried about the title of it. I was thinking, ugh, famine, Orphan. It doesn't sound like a real happy summer read, but I tried to inject just some fun parts and fun characters. I love the two characters that I came up with in the ad back,
Yes.
Malachi and Phineas, and I thought they were great fun. Even Kate says that it might not be that dull with these two here. And Bridie, I think, is somebody who comes through and, tells it like it is. And the music, there's always music and singing throughout. In fact, I came across just since I went to Boston last week at the Irish Cultural Center, there was a lady who came up to me and she said, have you heard the song, The Orphan Girls? And I said, no, I didn't know there was one. It's done by the Choral Society of the University College Dublin. And I found it on YouTube and it is just absolutely beautiful. It's a video of these girls all walking to the shore and they're sailing to Australia. It's like spine chilling. It's so good. And I'm hoping to try to figure out a way to get permission to use it in some way with the presentation of the book. But we shall see.
Yeah,
Yeah, we
definitely.
shall see. But it is uplifting. By the way, there's over 100 reviews on Goodreads for the Famine Orphans, and it has 4.3 stars. And Amazon so far is 4.6 stars. And those are pretty good reviews. And many of these, the women, mostly women who read it, they really cheered on the orphans. And they said they thought it might be a bit, of a downer at first, but it wasn't. That they were there with the girls every step of the way.
These girls,
Yeah.
they were so young. Kate was 16,
She
right?
was 16, and the youngest one in her group was 14. Mary,
Yes.
who was the one, yeah.
Oh, Mary, and she was in love.
It's like, there's nothing wrong with having a good cry. A friend of mine, a guy, actually, wrote to me the other day and said, I just finished that book in tears. But it was like not happy tears, but it just feels good to be so emotionally connected to something.
Absolutely. There are moments of grace when people are kind to these
Mm.
girls. And even the one person who was with the head cook or whatever she was at the big house, and she started out awful and then she actually did something
Yes.
nice.
Yeah.
Those little kindnesses are so very important.
They make you feel that there's still goodness in the world. That came up when I was speaking at Suffolk University group on Friday. And they asked the question, what have you taken away from all of your experiences 50 years ago at Suffolk? I'll be overstating it to say Suffolk saved my life, but they started my life. They gave me my start. And I said, the lesson that I take from it is that no matter how difficult things seem, if you have the faith and the persistence, there is always somebody or something somewhere that is going to give you a hand up. And I said, I try to do that in my own life. It's kind of like pay it forward because I feel like I was helped greatly, not just by Suffolk actually, but by other people that came into my life along the way that have helped me. And, I feel that obligation to pay it forward. And I think more than ever now, we need to be doing that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it may not seem that way, but we are all in this together, connected, and what we do matters.
It affects everybody, and we don't even realize how much power we actually have to help spread good and love and peace in the world. I mean, we just think we're helpless, and we're not. We
We
really
are not.
Speaking of that, I did want to ask whoever if they like the book or if they have something that they want to comment. I really appreciate all comments coming in from anyone because my goal is to have as many people read the story of these girls so that they're not lost to history. And the way books sell, we know, is by how many comments and stars. People don't think to do it unless you ask.
So people can review it on Amazon, they can review it on Goodreads.
Yeah.
And is there a way to comment on your website?
Yes, there's a way to contact me that is up there on my website. And I
Okay.
do put some of the reviews up. Well, I mean,
Okay.
I like them except for the one stars.
Yeah, sometimes I get comments on YouTube, and some of them are not very, shall we say, nice.
Yeah, they're not kind. They're not
And
kind.
but so what?
Yeah,
Because there are other ones that are,
yeah,
and I always say thank you.
I do too. I've been liking all of them
Yeah,
because if they took the time to do it,
exactly.
regardless,
Yes.
once in a while there is something in there that maybe they thought this section was slow or something about a character, the male characters weren't as good as the female characters. Yeah, there's things like that that I actually do take note of. But it's when they say, this was a total waste of time,
Yeah.
just so they can say it, I think. But most authors that I know, it takes a while, but particularly in the beginning, you get a 1 star or a 2 star. I mean, you can't sleep. And it's like, oh my God.
Right.
Because you
Yeah.
are very vulnerable. You're putting yourself out there like any artist, like a musician or poet or painter, maybe stand-up comedians. I mean, you're taking a chance and putting what is you out there and having people judge. And
Yes.
that takes a lot of doing. And we're, I think, primed to look on the bad side, that I'll read some 5 star reviews and be elated, but the one that'll stick with me will be the 1 star. But that's not happening anywhere near as much as it used to. When I've been around authors and we've shared experiences, everybody goes through that, 5 star, great, 1 star, oh God, type of thing. But get used to it because there's always going to be some. And it balances out in the long run. Hopefully, there's more good ones than bad ones. So we like that.
This is Kate Jones with Everyday Creation. For updates on Patricia's books and appearances, go to her website, patriciafalveybooks.com. Thank you for joining us today.